Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. Cybercriminals are using social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on victims, your employees, or your customers. Protect your Office 365 email from today's most sophisticated attacks with Barracuda Email Threat Scanner. It's a free tool to help protect your business from these hard-to-detect attacks. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner uses artificial intelligence to hunt and eliminate Office 365 email threats. Find the cybersecurity threats hiding in your Office 365 email right now. Get your free email threat scan at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Cyber Risk Alliance, in partnership with InfraGard, has launched the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Benchmark Study. Measure your readiness for ransomware by completing the survey and getting your score by visiting securityweekly.com/CIRB. If you want to stay in the loop, all things Security Weekly, subscribe to all the shows on the Security Weekly network. You can go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. All of our shows are available to subscribe individually to the audio or video versions of them. Of course, there's the main feed that has several of our shows all in one feed that you can use your favorite podcast catcher to subscribe to. Go to our YouTube channel, sign up for our mailing list, join our Discord server, and follow us on Twitch. Joff Thayer has joined us this evening. Joff, welcome.
It is good to be here. I just hung up on myself, but I'm back.
You're back. That's good. You're back, and you're teaching regular expressions again. You know, Joff, I was talking to someone about the cybersecurity training market in various aspects, and I said what I love and what I think is a really great thing and super popular is kind of ad hoc, and by ad hoc, not in a negative way in any sense, but ad hoc meaning like not tied to a degree program or certification track, ad hoc training that does a deep dive into a specific topic. And I used your class as an example.
Yes.
I'm like regular, like you want to spend, it's just a day class, right? A full day?
Yeah,
essentially 8 hours.
We do 4 hours.
It was 4 hours. So it's a half day, but like you learn stuff that's applicable to your job, like regular expressions, and you want to just deep dive into something specific, like regular expressions. I think it's great.
Yeah. So some of the feedback that I've had people literally after the first run come back and said, I used it the next day, like right on my job, right at that moment. I mean, it was, really, really well received. So I'm looking forward to doing it again. It is next Tuesday, July 27th. We have a bit.ly link again. I've got bit.ly/JoffRE Life. It's regular expressions, your new lifestyle.
I always just go to blackhillsinfosec.com and then I go to there's a training link on there. Right?
Is this a pay what you can show?
Learn. Yeah, there's a learn link, and then you go to training, and then it takes you to like Wild West Hackin' Fest, and that's where I look at all the training that you guys are doing, which I think all of your training is absolutely fantastic. Jeff, I have to ask, what's the kind of, how tall do you need to be to ride the ride for this regex class? Do you have to know Linux? Like you got to be proficient in Linux?
I would say that you have to have some basic Linux knowledge to ride the ride, but what I do is I cover anything from command line utilities all the way through to some PowerShell, a little bit of Python. I basically cover the scope of where you can use regular expressions in your professional life. And so I think everybody, so almost no matter your background and your penchant can probably get something out of it, right? Because regular expressions are so generally applicable, and it's not just InfoSec, right? It spans across the IT community. So it was really well received last time. I think it's going to be good.
Have some familiarity with Linux, a programming language, or Windows, or an operating system first. I'm thinking like my intern. My intern that's learning Linux. Yeah. I think I want him to be a little further along before I send him to this class.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I do a little Bash, I do a little grep, I do a little awk, I do a little bit of Python, a little bit of PowerShell. So if you got to be in the industry and have a little knowledge. Yeah, he's still
learning what those commands are. So I want him to be further along. But I think that's a good discussion we've had about what the kind of minimum requirements are.
Yeah. So it is pay what you can. We have a recommended minimum. It's not zero. The recommended minimum is $25. $25, right?
Yeah.
You could go to a bar one night and spend $25 easily, and all the way up to I think it's $125 on the upper end. And if your organization's paying, then do us the favor and give us the $125. But if it's just yourself, feel free to come in with whatever you feel like you can afford, and we'll have a good time.
It's awesome.
Joff, I think you and I have spent more than $25 in that bar. So I was just thinking, we've got
$25 is like maybe a round of drinks with Joff and I.
That would be on the low end.
That gets Joff and I like a margarita that we share lovingly in Las Vegas.
Well, yeah. Just remember, what happens in Reno stays in Reno.
There you go. Reno. It applies to Reno.
So it's Joff Thayer's regular expression life, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Learn to Love Regex.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, any one of those titles could apply, but people have been saying to me, regular expressions, your new lifestyle. Everybody's been saying, I totally want to borrow that. Your new lifestyle is so cool. I want to apply that to other class titles.
It is a lifestyle.
So yeah, it's going to be fun. So
I want to talk about Windows vulnerabilities and exploits. There was at least...
Do you really?
2 or 3, I do. I mean, I actually do,
There's just a few of them around.
There's a few. I want to start what I think is the bigger one. What I think is the more interesting one, and that is Sentinel-1 discovered a 16-year-old bug in a printer driver, ssport.sys, and it's an older printer driver from 2005. And they describe it as like, we were configuring a new printer, and then our team came across the driver, which I think is that's an interesting story in and of itself. But then they discovered vulnerabilities in it, and the rat hole goes deep on this one. 380 different HP and Samsung printer models, and a dozen by Xerox. HP manufactures those printers for Samsung and Xerox.
How do we get from HP to Xerox?
I was in the process of explaining that. HP.
Please, I'm sorry.
That's okay. HP manufactures those printers, because I had the same question, Jeff. I was like, wait.
Okay.
How does this go across basically platforms? If you're Samsung and you're like, hey, I want to make a printer, they go to HP, which I guess that makes sense, right?
Those driver packages and software packages are all just white labeled and rebranded. So the underlying driver functions are typically built out of an SDK. Yeah. And this one was actually built from a Microsoft SDK and still had some of the default code in it.
That's an old driver.
It's very, very old.
Is what we're saying. And since it's a driver, correct me if I'm wrong, gives you really high privileges if you're able to exploit this flaw.
Kernel level.
And ring zero. This
one's interesting because it starts as system, and it starts every single time, whether or not you've installed the software or not.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Is it higher level privilege, or is it lower level access to the system?
Depends on which operating system we're talking about. Because in Windows, ring 0 is the lowest level but the highest privilege. Shit, I'm going to forget which operating system. It's backwards, right? There's another operating system in architecture where it's completely backwards, right? Where ring 0 is the highest user level and ring 4 or whatever is the lowest
It's all
level.
just terminology, but the fact is you own it. You compromise a .sys driver, then you're compromising at the kernel level. And you compromising at the kernel level means you have access to all sorts of interesting things.
But what's interesting is whether... I don't have to install this? Like, how does it just, do I have to discover if there's a printer, even Linux does this, right? Like, if there's a printer on my network, there must be a broadcast protocol it's using to say, hey, there's a printer there. And it installs the driver?
It's in the software package for most of these, and it happens once you start the installation for the software package, whether you finish it or run through it or cancel it. Once the software package loads, the ssport.sys service driver gets configured to the system on initialization. And once that happens, it doesn't matter whether you configure it, whether you're hooking it up via USB wireless, it doesn't matter how you're actually interacting with the printer. This driver gets loaded on boot every single time, no matter how far you went. And that's not even the part of the exploit. That's really bad. Like that's a very old driver that gets loaded no matter what you do. But the real bad part is like the input-output control. This doesn't validate the size for the string copy that comes into the system. And so there's a buffer overflow there that you can overwrite memory space. So there's kind of a lot of things you can do with this. There's not a proof of concept.
ASLR doesn't protect the stack. Is this a stack overflow? Wouldn't it be ASLR protected?
This is a buffer overflow, but it's being loaded at ring 0 by the kernel, and it's a known and signed, or it doesn't even matter if it's a signed driver. This driver gets loaded as part of the boot, and so
that's an interesting question that Paul you were posing. Does ASLR play a role? And I'm going to make a guess here because I actually don't know, but I would guess at kernel level they're probably fixed memory addresses, and it probably does not play a role. Because ASLR more than likely is operating more in user land than at kernel level.
Right, because you don't want a kernel level to crash necessarily if it's randomizing the layout of where it is in memory.
There's things in kernel that need fixed addresses.
Right,
I mean, that's just the nature of it.
Yeah.
And that really depends on your exploit, right? Like this isn't the exploitation piece of this. This is just the driver that gets loaded that has a vulnerability within inside of it. The exploit, when you develop that exploit and how you utilize that buffer overflow and what you do with it, that's when you have to start worrying about your ASLR and like what memory addresses you're playing with and what you're actually doing with it.
Yeah, where you're going to jump back to.
Yeah, where's the weaponization of it?
Yep.
Oh, there's so many possibilities when you're at ring 0, though.
But now the next question from the defender side is, when this updates, is this like when you update Windows, does it come down as a security thing that automatically gets applied, or does it get applied like other drivers where it's like, hey, do you want to install additional drivers as part of your update? Which, I mean, I always do.
No, so this is a user loaded driver, right? So this gets put to the system by the user, like as if you installed a printer driver,
and not coming from Microsoft. Because there's some drivers that come from like even for like mostly my Intel devices. I think because Microsoft and Intel have a good partnership, right? Microsoft will say, hey, there's additional drivers. Like if my Intel architecture or board has Intel devices, like for the network stack or for the Wi-Fi adapter or for the USB bus, I'll get those from Microsoft. But what you're saying, Tyler, is this is a user-loaded driver that is outside of the Windows update process.
Correct. This is the old .sys driver that's specified with inside of the driver, the System32 driver folder, as part of an installed driver package.
So this is like .sys. .sys goes back to like DOS.
This goes way back.
Pretty much.
Yeah, .sys is way back. My actual open question is going to be how quick the different printer vendors going to deal with it, because there could well be a situation where one vendor's got the right version and another vendor has the wrong version. What if the other vendor with the wrong version gets installed over the right version? Or the patched version, right? And you end up downgrading back to the vulnerable version of the sys driver.
Yeah, and how do you actually... I see Microsoft actually maybe trying to figure out a way to patch this via the
Windows
update process.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, because that could be a real concern. So
I have a different question, and I want to change directions perhaps a little bit and get philosophical, because that's what I do. So this thing's gone undiscovered for 16 years. It now has a CVE number, right? That was in the heading.
Yep.
It does. 2021 3438.
Who or what figures out when a vulnerability like this is discovered, if it's exploitable, exploit exists in the wild? And what I'm getting at is, what took you so long to find this? I mean, and is there a philosophical question that should we really? And I'm not trying to pick on these guys, Sentinel-1, but is there a real benefit to finding 15, 16, 20-year-old vulnerabilities if there's no evidence that these things have been previously discovered by bad guys and being used in exploitations, or wouldn't we have already seen it?
You would assume that if it's been found, that it has been abused or looked at. Like most things in System 32, especially drivers, I'm going to say that there are large initiatives in many governments that look at these very critically and find ways to abuse them for access. That's historically proven.
So what I'm hearing you say, Tyler, is you already knew about this one. Old news.
This one I did not, but there are others that are like this that we utilize in, even in exploit kits. There's plenty of ways to abuse. I mean, just look at principle, right? Like you start looking at anything with inside of Windows that is old and legacy and backwards compatible. There are things that people have looked at and keep in their war chest for utilization like this. Now, the philosophical question is, do you bring this up to the public so that it gets fixed? Do you keep it quiet so it doesn't get exploited? And what kind of harm are you having in both directions?
Jeff, I think you bring up an interesting point in that when you described and posed that question, right? Like, what is Microsoft's motivation potentially to go discover this vulnerability, to go look at old code that's prevalent on their operating system? They didn't develop this driver, HP did. Right. But what is Microsoft's motivation to do that in an effort to protect their customers? What is HP's motivation to dedicate resources to go, like, hey, like, let's put together a whole team to go look at old drivers? Like how many times do you hear that? Like,
they're not going to do it.
They're not going to do that, right? So
they're relying on security researchers.
Yeah, the burden falls on security researchers and folks like SentinelOne, who I applaud for pointing out.
Which means there's a ton of this stuff that's undiscovered,
I agree, Jeff.
Right? And we all know it.
Yep.
I mean, there's layers and layers and layers. There's so many sys drivers out there for various things, and this stuff's going to go on and on and on.
I guess that's part of it. If I had an agenda for asking the question, I would agree with you, Joff. There's probably a ton of stuff like this out there, and you can make the argument. Yes, it's important to find all of them, but is it? Where do you rank it in terms of looking for the vulnerabilities and the new stuff that's coming out there that's much more public facing? That's probably a poor term, but much more on the radar screen of the bad guys that are trying to exploit stuff, much more low hanging fruit, so to speak. My other question, Paul, is going back to our interview last week where we were talking about, I forget his name, I apologize, the firmware guy. Was it Scott?
Yeah, Scott Shefferman from Eclipsium.
Where do you place in order of importance, less than well documented required things you should be doing to keeping your systems upgraded? Hardware, firmware, device drivers, software, operating system. This just seems like another layer that we don't all. I never ask a client about their drivers or anything.
There's much more important things to deal with, right? Like people are not getting the fundamentals right at a very bare minimum, where we're removing local admin, we're doing good password sanitization, we're doing just basics. So getting them focused on things where you're doing hardware analysis, you're leaving that to companies that are having to rely on things like hypervisor, like IBM Cloud or Azure Cloud. Like they have to rely on the ability for their hardware to be secure in order to support something like GovCloud. So I don't think that falls under the normal purview of even larger mature corporations that are trying to do security right. That's kind of outside of their purview. There's much more important threats to kind of deal with. And Microsoft's doing a good job with new code, so it's not necessarily all the new code. It's the legacy stuff that's still getting integrated. The pipeline and the way they test old code and the ability for the code moving forward into base operating systems, they've downsized a lot of the people that were doing that code analysis on legacy things. So it's kind of moved to the new CDIC pipeline where it's all the new code. They're doing automated and AI scanning of that new code, but we still have this legacy stuff that is not getting so much visibility unless it's by security researchers.
Yeah, I think there needs to be less focus on what the threat or vulnerability is versus what the impact is, right? And I think we kind of get hung up on what the latest trend is. Like, we need to protect ourselves against ransomware.
Right.
Ransomware is the impact. Ransomware is not the issue. It's not the vector
cause.
that we need to be focused on. What is the prioritizing those vectors and not being well, I need to secure the operating system, the applications, but I need to secure what is going to lead to the most impactful things against my organizations. I think in some organizations, Jeff, that could be drivers and firmware level things. For sure.
So, do we know what the score is of this CVE, the CVSS score?
No, there were so many this week. I think it was an 8.
I'll look it up while we're talking.
I think it's 8.8.
8.8.
Was this an 8.8
guy, right? But I think Paul's exactly right. I had a call with a customer exactly along those lines this week, and they started out like doing the normal, like, oh, ransomware is in the media, and I was like, okay, but let's focus on what exactly is getting that ransomware into your environment and what's spreading it, and let's have that discussion, and you have to redirect them into that discussion to talk about the fundamentals and talk about the basic security hygiene that will prevent them from being in the news and prevent them from being involved in a ransomware attack. Right?
Yeah, there was another Microsoft vulnerability, 2021-31956, exploiting the Windows kernel NTFS with WNF. This seems like
interesting.
Something that was disclosed previously by Kaspersky, and this researcher was like, well, Kaspersky developed the exploit for it, but didn't publicly release it, which is fine. But they were like, based on what was published, they went through this lengthy blog post of here's how I would exploit it, right? And I think this is a factor to looking at your overall risk posture as an organization and going, oh, yeah, someone can exploit this. So this blog post explains that based on the information that was out there, how could I, reading from the blog author's voice, right? How could I exploit this? And walks you through how to do that, which could change the impact, could change the likelihood and probability that this would happen in your environment.
Yeah, so I find this one really, really fascinating because I've actually been aware of WNF vulnerabilities for probably about 12 months now, probably way before they became public. We did a little bit of work on it.
And this is the Windows Notification Framework.
Yeah, facility, I think they call it, Windows Notification Facility.
The blog post says Windows Notification Framework, WNF, used
framework. You're right.
Used by the in-the-wild attackers to enable novel exploit primitives. Is how it's described.
Yeah, so there's all, as usual with the Windows operating system, there's whole subsystems that people spend time exploring.
Yeah.
That to the ordinary, regular day-to-day operations, people just not aware of, right? And this Windows Notification Framework is one of those that has a lot of attack surface to it. That it's just not evident in day-to-day use exactly what's going on, and it's not really a surprise that there's going to be some public exploits coming out around it, to at least to my knowledge, anyway.
The amount of detail in this post is ridiculous. It's amazing.
And this is just part one.
And it is labeled as part
it's going to
one.
keep on coming out. Yeah.
And I had not heard of the Windows Notification Framework, and how it ties into the file system is just amazing. But this blog post, go read this blog post. It says it's a 32-minute read. I love these things that estimate how long.
More like an hour.
Yeah, you're
I was
not
say an hour and a half trying to understand what he was.
Maybe if you're developing in this space or you work for Microsoft and were responsible for that, you could read it in 30 minutes. But the rest of us is going to take a much longer time to digest.
Hour and a half,
at least.
Yeah. Yeah.
Agreed.
So this is a very fascinating area. There's going to be, I think, a lot that will come out over time as people unwind this and start to really dig in.
Oh, speaking of unwinding the print spooler vulnerability, we've got a new
segue,
a new unpatched, and this came from a researcher at Dragos. Jacob Baines, for identifying this issue. CVE 2021-34481 is another. This looks like a privilege escalation vulnerability in the Windows print spooler, and this is par for the course, right? Whenever you have one vulnerability in something like a print spooler, which we can go back to Stuxnet and talk about the other print spooler vulnerabilities. Then you get the print, what do they call it? Print nightmare is what we're calling it now.
Print nightmare, yeah.
Print nightmare V1, 2, 3, or 4.
And then
volume 4.
Once we start on, for pun intended, unraveling the print spooler even more, we find more and more vulnerabilities. Which is, I mean, this is in the 16 years of doing the show now, right? Par for the course. I mean, this is like history repeating itself.
Yeah, these ones are kind of scary though, because they're incomplete patches, and there's no patch in sight for some of these. They just can't get them out fast enough, and some of them break general functionality. So
like
these
they're patching the patch, right? There's patches that patch the original vulnerability. Then there's a patch that patches the patch, and then there's a patch that patches like the offshoot of the vulnerability.
Well, like Nightmare Hive, like the other new one with being able to read the SAM and system hives as a regular user, right? Like there's different versions of update releases depending on when you installed or what media you installed from, and whether you got the latest update from the nightly release or from your long-term support agreement. Like that mattered as far as whether or not you were patched, and it's really hard to determine whether or not you're still vulnerable.
And that's not frightening at all, right? I mean,
it's
so silly question leading to a soapbox moment. This Windows print spooler, you would think that people are only going to use it or need to have it installed if they're actually connected to a printer and want to actually print something, correct?
No.
So here's my soapbox moment, because I see this all the time with customers looking for secure configurations and hardening documents and guidelines, and you get to the Windows and it's pretty much a stock install. It's not plug and play like it was 15, 20 years ago, because Windows 10 is, pretty secure out of the box. But it would be nice if we could package this up in a way as sort of evidence that this is a reason why you should go through and remove stuff that's just part of the Windows install package that you're not using. You don't need it. Get rid of it.
I think Microsoft has to do a better job of allowing us to do that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. They really there tends to be a whole lot of stuff that's still like thrown into the barrel, and we need to be able to be a little bit more selective. And print spooler would be one of those. That is
very true.
Yeah, I'm picking on Microsoft here, but I also believe Linux and Mac OS are also, every operating system is guilty of this, especially when it comes to printers. Because users just want printers to work. And I think even open source operating systems are shipping this stuff so that printers just work. And a lot of this stuff is enabled by default, right? Yeah. And hard to rip it out. Hard to say, I want to download an Ubuntu without printer support. When you download Ubuntu 20.04 today, the desktop version, it ships with printer support. When I bring it up for the first time on my network, I get a notification. It's like, hey, you got a printer on your network.
Well,
like,
users,
I'm not printing
users
from
are always
system.
going to want to print.
Yeah,
right? Like even businesses.
Right.
Like there's no way around printing. Printing is a function of business, and interoperability and the ability for an OS to function for general consumers is always going to be a thing. Even if you don't have printers on the network, right? Like something like print to PDF. That's a function built into Office. That's a function built into your operating system as a general function. That requires spoolers. So you can't just go and disable this. It's not quite that simple. There's a lot to it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but don't forget, we've also got the thing that, remember when we first were starting with this stuff, you had to go find all the drivers and everything from whether it was your keyboard to
remember? It was awful.
And now, the OSs come with drivers that will work with most, or generic, and then you can load a vendor-specific one if you even need it. So that's why they're getting fatter, and they got all that stuff thrown in, so things just work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was painful to have to find and update drivers. I mean, it flat out sucked, but it was a bit more of a secure space.
But then you had nefarious drivers because you were always looking at like, what was it, driver detector or one of the others that was finding like all these obscure drivers.
You're taking me back to
side-loaded drivers.
Windows 98 days, right? You had to go install Windows 98 on someone's workstation, and they had even a printer. XP. Then you had to go Google, like, was there even Google? Like, you had to go find the driver, Jeff, to your point. It might not have been Google.
It was Alta Vista, probably.
Yeah, to go find that driver and install that driver. And I think that was a pain point for many users where, Lee, to your point, they're bundled in the OS now, so it's a better user experience. And here we are with all these printer vulnerabilities.
No, so maybe for specifically these printer spooler and printer driver issues, printing is a vital thing, but it's not. I mean, you can do it over the network and stuff like that. But is there a way to like take the whole? I don't know what Microsoft calls it. Is it a bundle? Is it a package of all the print drivers that are somehow contained in the operating system? And can you just disable them all in one swell foop?
So there's a lot of ways to harden like Windows.
That's a swell
Windows.
Tyler, we want a swell foop of print. I know you. Your family your family did printers or something, right? Like you've got a lot of experience with printers.
Spent a lot of time with printers, PPDs, like all the drivers over decades. And honestly, like we're at a point where you can harden Windows. Windows is very, very configurable, and you can do that from GPO, from administration level. Like this is not an unsolved problem. There's STIGs, there's configuration states, you could even go all the way down to like something like a Pixie boot with answer files, right? Like you can go old school, and you can be very granular at how you set up your Windows, but that takes effort. And we go back to security conundrum of things that are hard to do and take time. Only the very, very mature are doing those for very specific reasons. And even that, there may be loopholes, but something like a STIG or a configuration hardening guide where you're following that, you may be better off because you've disabled a lot of this. That doesn't mean you're out of the woods, but
you're likely better off though.
Yeah, but I'd put that on the operating system vendors to go, when you install it, like, do you want printer support, right? Like, let's use an easier example. When you install Ubuntu, it doesn't come with OpenSSH server by default. When you install Ubuntu server, it asks you, like, hey, do you want to install an OpenSSH server on it or not? I also want the option to say, like, do you want printer support? Like,
you do have that ability when you're doing it for a large organization as part of how they've designed Windows to be deployed. If you're just doing it like off a default installation media, then you're not doing that. But if you're doing it how Microsoft's designed it to be deployed large scale and highly configured, and you do the configurations, then you have all that granular control, and a lot of places do that.
Right. But a lot of places don't remove the printer support because they don't want to deal with the support that accompanies that.
Here's a question for you, Paul. Which do you think is more secure? The old model where you had to compile all your loadable modules into the kernel. There wasn't a dynamic loader, or like the new model that Apple's going down, where there are no loadable kernel modules. They're loadable modules, but they can't load in the kernel anymore. So they can't run with scripting 0.
I think the most secure model, Lee, is one that lets you choose which functionality gets built in. Right, but then when the question is like, what are the right questions to ask and allow you to configure, right? Like how granular do you want to go? Right?
But you're also the 1%, even like IT people, right? Like you're talking about a demographic of security focused and IT people with a long history of experience versus the demographic of people that they sell to, which is going to be who they're building the product towards. And that's going to be the least friction point for long term. Yeah, there's vulnerabilities, but that's kind of cost of doing business, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a business risk case.
Who's going to choose the Windows install that lets me say, like, I want SMB or I don't. I want printer functionality or I don't, right? But if I've got a Windows PC and it's serving a specific purpose, for example, I just want to play games. Like, do I even need the SMB subsystem? Do I even need the print spooler? I don't. But the option doesn't easily exist to let me exclude those options. Maybe we'll see a day where it does. but I still
there's so much integration between like the kernel and like how Windows operates at NTFS and SMB, like pipes and how
even in Linux and Mac OS, man, that stuff is hard to separate. It really is to have that truly modular experience. So in any case, we got really down a rabbit hole on that one.
Yeah, we did.
Let's talk about
Microsoft cracks down on domains.
Let's keep on the Microsoft theme. Keep on the keep beating the Microsoft drum. And I'm not bashing Microsoft in any. In fact, in this story, I chose to defend Microsoft, quite frankly, because my story number 7 is Microsoft. I think you might have had the story too, Lee. Right? Is Microsoft a national security threat? I mean, I don't buy it. Regardless of what operating system you have, you're just as vulnerable. In the article very quickly goes into like, poses the question, is Microsoft a national security threat? And they ask basically one question to prove or disprove that point is Microsoft more attacked and more vulnerable because it's more popular or not? And they spend several pages debating that point.
They were on the debate team. I know they were.
They were on the debate team, they're debating the same point, just in like using different like English phrases to say the same thing. So like 3/4 of the article probably could have been consolidated into like one paragraph. They get to the end and they say organizations rely on Windows will have a hell of a time migrating away from Windows and the rest of the Microsoft ecosystem, which means that they're naturally going to drag their toes. The bigger they are, the slower any attempt at a migration will go. So they're talking about like, do you move off Microsoft's platform or not? And they're like, maybe this means that there's plenty of time for those that can easily migrate away from the madness and insecurity of Microsoft as a means of sheltering themselves from a barrage of attacks. Like they're just getting into like the operating system wars. And I'm like, that's me, it boils down to Apple hides their vulnerabilities the best they can. No one wants to take the time to find and disclose a big percentage of all those Linux vulnerabilities. Qualys is making a go at it, which I think is cool. And then you've got Microsoft, which is the largest install base. Therefore, it's the most attacked and most vulnerable. And there's lots of ways you could measure this too.
Secure, though. Like I would argue it has the most security features, the most configuration, and if done properly, it will stand up against any one of those. The problem they didn't take into account was they're definitely not an operations person. You want to migrate off of Microsoft. Like, tell me how you do that enterprise-wide and manage at scale without introducing all the same vulnerabilities into like a Mac shop with local administration, SSH keys. Like you can't orchestrate.
You get in the jump cloud, you get in the AWS, you got to find a directory service.
There's just no way.
You might have a chance to do that in 1984, but you can't do that in 2021. There's no way.
That's right. That's right. Look, I would make the argument that Paul made. I mean, Microsoft.
Is that me in your background? What is going on right now?
Oh my God. I mean, Microsoft's been through the pain, right? Time tested. They've done what few others have done, right? So are they a national security threat? Absolutely not. In fact, I would say that they're more of an asset in that respect because they've done the work, right?
Yeah.
So I disagree with all of you, and I agree with all of you, but it all boils down to the definition of the term threat. I think you guys are having a knee-jerk reaction to. We've just had a lengthy discussion about 2 vulnerabilities that Microsoft are present in Microsoft systems. If you keep in mind the risk equation, where risk is a measurement of the likelihood of something bad happening, and it's based on threats, vulnerabilities, and the security countermeasures that you do to minimize the impact of the threats and the vulnerabilities. Threats are more or less a constant. Vulnerabilities are essentially, at least originally intended, the variable. You try to drive down the vulnerabilities. It is more and more constant these days. I agree with you, but in terms of the way I learned the risk equation, the threats are the bad guys. They're the things that want to do bad things to you. It's sort of morphed into the bad things that can happen, because it's somewhat automated, and it can be things, not just people at this point. So in that context, yes, Microsoft, because of its prevalence in terms of its ubiquitous.
But what you're
so
saying, Jeff, is Microsoft's vulnerabilities could be the threat to national security. Microsoft itself is not the threat to national security. That would mean that Microsoft is attacking the nation, right?
You have a computer that's a threat. Yeah. I don't care what make or model it is. It's a threat. You're putting data. You're conducting business using some sort of technology. That in and of itself is a threat. Something bad could happen using that piece of technology. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, the computer's not the threat. It's the person that wants to do bad things with it. That's the threat.
By market share, yeah, they're the most utilized computer system. They're the most heavily adopted. They're what hold the data.
Right.
But they also have the capability to have visibility where the other ones do not. The premise is like you should migrate off because the other ones are less attacked.
I disagree with that premise. You have threats, you acknowledge them, and you do something about it. In this case, you as a company, Microsoft has a program for discovering vulnerabilities and disclosing vulnerabilities, and they have bug bounty programs, and they have their Patch Tuesday, and they've come light years in producing secure operating systems out of the box, despite what we say every week. But we acknowledge that, but still they're a target for the bad guys to find more vulnerabilities and ways to exploit to get some ultimate outcome, which is what you're worried about as an organization: the risk of loss of data, the risk of an impact to your business, the risk of your ability to conduct business in the case of ransomware. So all I'm saying is, as an industry, we don't really understand this terminology very well, and it overlaps in our minds a lot. I had an email. I might have mentioned this on the show last week. I apologize if I did, but I had an email from some marketing firm wanting me to talk to their CEO because their product eliminates risk. And I'm like, well, risk is not something you eliminate. It's a measurement.
Yeah. Well, and I think when we talk about the different operating systems, I think we have stories to kind of back up some of our hypotheses that Microsoft has done a really good job in helping secure things, taking down the Cyrillic characters and domain names and stuff like that, right? That Linux is this platform where you have to have talented people that can go find all these vulnerabilities in the code. That doesn't make Linux any more or less secure. It's just a whole bunch of other software that needs to be secured. And you've got Apple that very much... I mean, you could look back in the history in the beginnings of this show, and we've covered where they're just sweeping shit under the rug all the time, and we've got stories that back up all those points. Which
I think that's going to change in the very near future with a lot of the ransomware. So all of the ransomware has now adopted a couple new kits as part of the OS X or Mac OS. Integration and capabilities. Like we have tons of kits. We have the capability to do all the same things we do on Windows. It just they're not as prevalent, so we use them when we need them. And ransomware is starting to see that a lot of shops are adopting that and moving, high risk or high asset portions of their development cycle, maybe their marketing, all of those places that are integral parts of their business. Now they're going to start seeing ransomware on the Macs, and that's just hasn't hit the media yet. So there's not as many, there's not as much publicity around that.
Well, let's talk Linux for a moment. Qualys researchers, who we've had on the show multiple times talking about their research, they're doing a fantastic job. I applaud their efforts. I love when they release new things. I also love that one of the things they disclosed, before we get into Sequoia, was a denial of service vulnerability in Systemd. And that's what you get for using Systemd rather than System 5 init. Joff, I knew you guys would appreciate that statement. I've been waiting all night to just drop that bomb.
It's beautiful. By the way, Lee's background is absolutely fantastic. But look,
I had to bring out the big gun.
There you go.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, bring out the big guns. But we all had trouble moving to away from the System 5 init, right? Yep. Because it was predictable, it was manageable, et cetera, et cetera. But the boot process in Linux was horribly sequential, right?
Yes,
and
it was.
we had
You're
to
right.
do it,
It
right?
was.
And,
yeah. There are some benefits to systemd. I agree.
Yeah,
agree.
There are. There definitely are. Hey,
but anyway, that was a denial of service, a strictly denial of service vulnerability. I do link to it in the show notes. The one that I find it's actually really fascinating to read through this kind of, I'm fascinated with the thought process, like that you would analyze, Qualys team analyzed code and was like, if I create a directory structure whose total path length exceeds 1 gigabyte, that's my first step to executing this local privilege escalation vulnerability. Like, think about that for a moment as to how many bytes a directory takes up, and to create a directory structure that is 1 gigabyte in size. Like, that is amazing in and of itself. In doing that, the unprivileged attacker can then go on to, it's a multi-stage attack, right? A 10-byte string / deleted to an offset of exactly, what is it, -2 gigabyte to 2 gigabytes to 10. There's the whole, gets into really. It sounds
like a classic integer overflow issue.
I don't know if it was a buffer overflow in vmalloc is what they found. Uncontrolled out of bounds write, and then basically full root privileges. They've got a demo, they basically compiled some C code that automates all this exploit. It works on Ubuntu 2004, 2010, Ubuntu 2104, Debian 11, all the latest Linux distributions.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And Sequoia, I think, is great as a great name, because they're creating a really big forest, like a directory tree.
Exactly.
Which, very aptly named.
Well, so it actually was something I was going to point out just in the last story, and it's illustrative here as well. And that is something that the community could get away with for a long time, was to say that the BSDs and the Linuxes were more secure, but the little hidden secret was they offered less functionality. And of course, if you decrease the operational attack surface, of course they're going to be mitigating risk and be more secure, right? But when you're an operating system out there,
yeah, but that's not the case. I mean,
not the case anymore.
It was a farce.
Right.
It was a farce for us to believe that millions and millions and millions of line of C code was more secure than what Microsoft or Apple or anyone else was putting out, right? How it doesn't matter. Once you reach that millions of lines of code, there's going to be vulnerabilities. And many people stood up on their soapboxes and said, well, Linux is more secure, Apple's more secure. I'm like, dude, no, it's not. That's a farce. And if you were in the know, even 10, 15 years ago, I had very smart people tell me, dude, Linux has so many holes that just aren't being disclosed. And look, props. I mean, Qualys is a sponsor. Independent of that, props to them for going, no, it's not secure. And guess what? We'll help you find those flaws, and we're going to report them and get some of these fixed. That's pretty cool. We need more people like Qualys helping us with this, because even the talented team at Qualys can't point out all these flaws, discover them, and disclose them in a reasonable amount of time. Forget it.
Well, here's my contention, Paul. And it's not a farce. It was a marketing campaign.
Yeah, it was. Come use Linux. It's more secure, right? It was totally a marketing. Absolutely.
And I remember those days, and I didn't believe it for a minute. I knew that nobody was looking at it because there was that much Linux in the world, and there was this much Windows. So it was just. That's just good economic sense from the bad guy perspective.
Agreed.
You astutely observe that vulnerabilities are more or less a constant these days in the sense of a risk equation. I absolutely agree with that. I would go so far as to say our whole industry needs to get over this hunt for vulnerabilities and acknowledge that threats exist, acknowledge that vulnerabilities are more or less a constant. They're not going away. We're never getting to the point where everything is completely secure in the sense that we discover no more vulnerabilities. What's left in the equation? What we call security. What is that if it's not all this stuff that we do trying to run down and discover and detect and patch vulnerabilities or detect the threats and have the threat intelligence agents and threat this, threat that, and threat the other.
Yeah, or architect to mitigate, right? Architect to mitigate.
You can't. I mean, if there's anything we've learned up until this point, is you can't trust the software that's running on your device. I think that's why, largely incorrectly, but right or wrong or indifferent, zero trust is a thing, because I think we're quickly realizing that we can't trust the software that we're running on our devices because, like I said, like vulnerabilities are a constant. They always have been. I mean, Jeff and I worked for a vulnerability vendor. There's one thing we could say is that vulnerabilities are a constant. There's research teams in all the major vulnerability companies. They're just finding and writing checks for vulnerabilities. It's a constant. What that means is you can't trust your software. So what do you do? I think it's why we're messaging on zero trust.
Well, and I had a couple articles. One, zero trust is actually in the title, how data discovery and zero trust can help defend against a data breach. The other one that I chuckled over was trust no one should be our new security motto. And I'm like, really? That's new?
No, that was an X-File. I used to have the poster from the X-Files with the UFO, right? And it said, trust no one.
It predates the X-Files.
Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does.
But, go ahead, Lee.
So I'm just starting to skim this, and I'm like, they're saying companies aren't sharing. Well, how much? Yeah, that's valid. Getting people to share and talk and trade information, and particularly when they've been had, is something that's really need to be addressed.
But the problem is there's always a balance there. Like, no matter how much we agree that trust, like zero trust, is where we want to get, there always has to be functionality. We will always have to inherently, like, at least in my lifetime, we're always going to have to inherently trust certain things, certain software, certain drivers, certain pieces of hardware, certain functionality in order to
firmware.
Function.
You missed last week, Tyler. You got to trust them.
It's annoying. It's annoying, right? So I manage a lot of Linux systems, not a lot, a fair number of Linux systems, I should say, and I want to make sure that they're patched and up to date. And to do that, I have to use the
update.
I have to use the apt command, right? And the update, I have to trust that process at the end of the day, and that's, to me,
functionality and
that's
the ability
the scariest
to utilize
thing.
Your stuff. There's always going to be a balance.
I would venture to say I trust the Windows update process more so than I trust the Linux update apt process, to be quite honest with you, because Microsoft protects.
I'd agree with that
right?
assessment.
Microsoft protects that more so than many other things in this world. When we talk about software and companies and what they protect and trust, Microsoft protects that update process. I get a little leery because there's so many distributions, so many people, a loosely kind of formed organization. I don't think they put as much attention and focus on that trust level to, like, what code goes into the apt binary, what code runs the servers where I'm pulling these packages from. It's dicey.
Well, do you remember back when, to get like the source code for SunOS, it cost like $20,000 or $40,000?
I remember when it was 6 figures.
Yeah, those are the early days.
Unless NSA wasn't getting a discount.
They probably
not. Probably not.
I will say at that time we got the educational pricing. We had the source for PSW.
There was educational pricing for the software.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, if the government could pay more, I'm sure they did. I had never heard a firm number, but I always.
But wait, Lee,
what I had heard was. Yeah.
Lee, where were you going with that?
What was your point, Lee?
Yeah, I want to know where you're going.
So my point was, back then, the source for the operating systems weren't easily available, and so discovering vulnerabilities like this was really difficult unless you had the source and you had all the agreements that were, how you were and weren't supposed to use it. I'm just, I'm remembering back to, we had BSD 4.2 systems that somebody had hand ported all of the NFS routines to, and then added security to them. They were looking through them and said, "Oh my God, it doesn't check what network you're trying to do NFS from. We'll add some config in for that." And I was just thinking about that, reading what Qualys had done, as you're going through this source. If you actually
the source, but I don't know. I think
who has time for that now?
Yeah,
right?
I think that depends on the person, the methodology. I think some people and processes lend itself to, yeah, cool, I got the source, I can be effective. There's other processes and people that can be equally as effective without the source. I don't
this is
think
a good use case where ML and AI like should start to fill in the gap to cover 80%, and then you have the creative the creative 20%.
Can you mute that, man?
That's what it's there for. Like, we need to utilize it in a more efficient manner, but that only covers 80%. We're always going to have that 20% that is going to require creative people to look at those slashes at the code, at the nuances, and dig in very, very deeply. But
and if you look at what Qualys has done, though, I think that's where your AI and ML falls down, because they're chaining multiple vulnerabilities together.
Yep.
I don't think AI and ML is quite there.
But it should cover. No, it's not going to be, and I don't think it ever. At least in my lifetime, it's not going to. But it should be covering that 80%. This is the 20%.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking about the basics and covering the
I don't know
code
if it's 80-20. Maybe 50-50.
50-50?
Maybe 50. I'd go with 50. I'd be on board with 50-50.
Yeah, I mean, that really depends on your data sets, right? Like, again,
I'm thinking 49-51.
There you go.
Just to be ornery.
Okay. We have a lot of good stories. Let's keep going.
Let's keep going.
Like, I don't know about this homoglyph domains. Like, I've always heard it like doppelgangers, but Microsoft cracks down on homoglyph domains.
So my question on this one, I have my own kind of theories on this, but brand monitoring tools should be able to identify typo squatting domains that are using homoglyph characters. No, I would think that's a pretty easy. We can solve this with code and automate. This is where I would say most of the time you can solve this.
Don't say
code. Dare I say AI and ML? You could solve this.
This is solved. This is solved, but no one's using it. That's the problem. Like, even major corporations and domains, like big names, are just starting to get into this brand, because it's got a different label. It's brand and market analysis, or it's brand protection.
It's a security thing, though. It's a security thing, because
it's a security thing. But
the clip is from the article is the attackers hijacked legitimate Office 365 email communications to send an impersonation email from a homoglyph domain that had a single letter changed, convinced the victim that the message came from a trusted source, claimed that they were the CFO, to put a hold on the account, and ask for payment. I mean, this is like
it's like the oldest trick in the book.
It's like the most basic phishing attack. But the thing that made it believable was the character in the domain.
Yeah, most firewalls look at that. Most categorizations and analyze that, and they don't let it in. It's when you're starting to talk about vendors and third party or supply chains. Like, usually this is against another company from a trusted domain, right?
Microsoft should not have had to take down these 20 domains, because this is a solvable problem, is what I'm hearing.
It is. Yeah. I'm glad that Microsoft's doing it, because not many companies are monitoring it. Like, we should have a technical segment that outlines the different products that are available for brand protection and doppelganger protection. Like, that seems like a great segment. Do we need homoglyph characters in
domains, period? Can't we just... Isn't can we solve this by just banning that?
No.
No, you can't.
That's what not homoglyph characters are. Homoglyphs are like, you replace an L with a capital I. Yeah. It's similar looking character. If you had UTF-8 characters in it, that'd be more interesting. But for just regular Latin characters, you can just do letter substitution, so visually it looks the same.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that, Lee, because we did use the UTF stuff for a while, but then the browser vendors started displaying the full domain name. You could use Punicode and get away with that for a little while, where you would put the little dot underneath the O, and it was amazing what you could get away with. But that doesn't work so much. Homoglyphs is still an issue.
And homoglyphs are like
an attack strategy. We use it all the time. I mean, I'll still use it, and you can defeat 2FA with it as well, because you can reverse proxy in front of their authentication mechanisms that are cloud facing and take the traffic through there. You can capture not only the credential, you can capture the 2FA as well, and then you have a window of actual access to the organization. So it is a serious issue.
Yeah,
Dimitri says it's solvable. So
I mean, there's a ton of products out there.
Yep, I trust Dimitri too.
Yeah,
So,
I don't disagree that we can't write tools to detect this. It's just you can't
people
ban
aren't
the
using them. Well,
I mean,
people aren't
isn't it
monitoring.
as simple? Isn't it as simple as there are a different ASCII character and
Yeah, I mean, you just
the
go through and do
alphabets
some-
within a range of ASCII?
Yeah, but what if your domain name has a 1 in it, right? Like that's a valid domain. You put a 1 in it, and it's hard to distinguish. Yeah, you're distinguishing between whether or not something's valid or not valid, and that may be valid for certain places. The problem really is that people are, or companies are not utilizing the tools that are out there to monitor this. And even if they are, it's usually the people that they're attacking, it's coming from a vendor. So if their vendor is not monitoring, then they're still at risk. They're the ones that are being attacked by a vendor doppelganger.
Right. Yeah. Even if you limit it to ASCII, you still have the problem, and you still need to monitor. To Tyler's point, Pegasus has made the news.
I knew you were going to go there.
Right, but the interesting thing, I mean, Pegasus is a thing, right? Is it the NCO group? The Israeli firm? Is it NCO? Yeah. Did I say that right? NSO group, right? Makes the spyware that years ago was used to spy on journalists, and I would imagine that Israeli government, right, is using to protect its country, right, spy on its enemies, which makes sense. I listened to a lot of podcasts lately, about not cybersecurity related, right, but the conflicts that Israel is in a constant battle with. It makes sense that they would want this technology to be able to protect their country, and I don't fault them for that in any way. But the Pegasus software has been used to spy on journalists, but this is a malware package, right? It's got to get on the phone itself, and there are what the media is calling zero-click exploits that allow this on Android and iOS, from what I understand. And these are essentially my take on this is zero-day flaws, which in Android wouldn't be totally surprising, but in iOS is kind of surprising, as the walled garden has failed in this sense that there are basically O-days out there for iOS that bypass all the protections that Apple has put in place, that are allowing bad actors to install Pegasus software, which, if you read my kind of clip from the article, is really scary. Copies call histories, text messages, calendar entries, contacts, camera and phone microphones are compromised to eavesdrop, and even track movements and steal messages from end-to-end encrypted chats, right? Because at the end of the day, I think people have a misconception. Signal, for example. Signal is amazing. Doesn't work? Signal is amazing. They implemented an amazing crypto system. I can't pretend to explain that to you, but if you notice, if you open the Signal app on your phone, you can read your messages, which means if you've got malware on your phone, conceivably they could probably do the same thing if they have low-level access to your phone. Yeah.
Huh. Who'd have thought that?
Right. Like after you decrypt a message, let's put it in Jeff, in your like after you decrypt a message, if you can see that, conceivably others could as well, depending on your protections.
Well, it's before or after. Technically, you can attack. There's two ends to the encrypted communication path.
That's right. That's right.
So it's really
Jeff and I have been saying this for years. Jeff and I laugh about this all the time because everybody gets into the great encryption debate, right?
Who cares?
Governments want to backdoor it. Oh my God, encryption's bad. It allows criminals to do things. Bullshit. When you get on the end device, it's unencrypted. It's always going to be unencrypted somewhere. Right. And it's usually right on the end device.
Either you have the key or you're looking at it after the key has decrypted it, right? I mean, that's really... Those are the constants in encryption, right? You're most often not attacking the algorithm. You're attacking the key management, or...
You almost never attack the algorithm. Almost never.
I can remember a PCI kind of related thing, right? You could have really good encryption. However, if the operating system was vulnerable and it was a point-of-sale device, and I could put malware on that point-of-sale device that was capturing the screen, and the credit card number was appearing in clear text on the screen so someone could see it. If I can capture the screen, I can see the credit card number. I actually did that in a pen test years ago.
Which is why one of the PCI requirements is don't display the whole number.
And they were obviously not PCI compliant at the time, which was a finding, of course.
Well, I mean, you might be able to remember the days when the whole number was printed on a receipt.
Yeah.
I remember those days, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then the PCI came out and said you can print the first 6 or the last 4. And I remember shortly thereafter that I started getting receipts where there was the last 4 on one receipt visible, and on another receipt it was the first 6 that they were allowing, which really reduced. Yeah. Anyway,
reducing your key space. Yes. But the Pegasus thing, I mean, the coverage was interesting because journalists are the ones that were largely being attacked. So the Guardian was all over this story. Had some good articles on it.
Another one I thought was
it's
interesting.
A tool.
Sorry, Tyler.
No, I'm just, everyone gets all up in arms about these tools. Like, there are all kinds of tools like this. Like, you can spy on your ex, you can monitor your kids, you can do all of these capabilities with a bazillion
Pop quiz,
tools.
Tyler. Is it a threat or is it a vulnerability? Or is it a risk?
It's a threat.
It's a threat. I would agree.
Very good.
Yep.
God, man. Somebody say PCI before I have to drink.
Where do you want to go next?
I have one article that I thought it was kind of humorous, and I'm sure it's a very serious story, but China is getting ready to publish their equivalent of GDPR.
Oh, that is interesting.
Are you kidding?
I'm not kidding.
I mean, that's really just marketing, in my opinion. I mean, right? Like when you have countries like North Korea,
personal information,
is it just bragging?
Law.
Is it just bragging?
There's a hierarchy, right? Like Cuba, North Korea, China. Like they're different.
It's funny that it's named Pipple, like kind of like the database of people.
Yeah, like that's
people. That's how they pronounce it.
They're going to have a one-line document. We will continue doing what we've always done.
Yeah, but I think it's a lot of it's propaganda at the end of the day, right? When we talk about communist countries, I think this reeks of propaganda, right? Like trying to make the people feel good, but doing just the opposite to destroy their privacy on the back end. And I think that's really a kind of a theme that we've seen in many communist countries. There are some great podcasts out there. In fact, we had Jack on last week. Jack did a great interview with someone who defected from North Korea. He also is how I found out about the Jordan Harbinger show. And Jordan is interviewing a 2-part interview series with someone who infiltrated North Korea from Denmark. There's like a group in Denmark that sympathizes with North Korea in like basically a fan club for North Korea. And he kind of posed as being part of this group and collected intelligence and brought he was basically a mole and talks about some very scary experiences. Like,
that's no way to live your life. That's a
for the record. People extends an existing law called the Personal Information Security Specification, or PIS.
Right.
Yes. That's so appropriate.
My estimation not a whole lot of research I've done. They're not all about privacy, right? And I want to so Jordan's doing this interview, and the person he's interviewing is like, yeah, so I stayed at a hotel, went for a walk on the beach, and like reached a certain point where I saw some people fishing, and I wanted to go towards them, and someone like came out of nowhere and said, no, so you have to go back to your hotel. That person had been following them, walking in the woods like the entire time. Like, these countries are not about privacy in any capacity.
Oh no.
Yeah. So
moving on.
Next story. Oh, I want to talk about, we've talked about this in many different ways over the years, but it just happens to manifest itself in SonicWall warning of an imminent ransomware campaign targeting its end-of-life equipment. And so, if you don't want ransomware, your choices are upgrade your device, or, if you can't upgrade your device, then you have to pay us to go to the next revision of the hardware so that you can upgrade your device. Or their recommendation, I shit you not, the effective end-of-life devices with the 8X firmware are past temporary mitigations. Continued use of this firmware or end-of-life devices is an active security risk, and their recommendations are to remove those devices from the network. SonicWall is recommending that they disconnect devices immediately. That's what they say. So I got a firewall, like it's end of life, and if I don't want ransomware, I got to just take it out of service. Like, whoa, wait. What if that's my firewall or my VPN? Like, what? So I just have to rip the device out.
I have mixed feelings about this because you know it's a real problem, right? I mean, you've got dated hardware, you're writing software for the current generation, you've got this, legacy issue. Somewhere as a company you have to draw the line.
Yeah. But somewhere you have to take care of your customer's job. So I interviewed a customer of Checkpoint, and he was like, I wanted this feature, and they were like, that's in the next revision. Like, let's use 8 and 9. I'm on version 8. The feature's in version 9. And he's like, no. My 200 people at my call center are all working remotely. They are not here in the office, and they're all using version 8 to get into the office. Therefore, you will port this feature to version 8. And Checkpoint said, okay, yes, we'll do that. And I think this is a disservice to smaller businesses, which SonicWall appeals to, where they're not going to make that call, right? You're not going to have that much influence because you're not spending that much money with the company, which is awful, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the better choice I think would be to say, we'll do it, but there is a cost, and here's the actual penalty that you'll pay in performance, or maybe
an increased support charge, right?
Yeah, something
a nominal support charge,
or something like an extended support contract.
Agreed, Jeff. Right? Yeah, a few $1,000s a year to cover our costs because we had to backport this fix, right? Like whatever.
Yeah.
Something reasonable. Ripping out your firewall is not reasonable.
On the other hand,
the hard line. They took the hard line and said, no, you need to upgrade. Damn it.
I mean, who knows? I mean, how long do you give customers to upgrade? 5 years, 10 years? Like, I also, in some respects, sympathize with the vendor as well.
Well, as an extension to that, Paul, it's pretty rare that any vendor of any major, network device operating system is just going to go, I think we need to retire that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Microsoft publishes a list. You can look at every single operating system.
You typically get like a year of
station.
No,
it's like
over a year, right?
Yeah, it's like a decade. I mean, they've got there's a whole chart. I have to look it up all the time to try to tell my customers, you've known about this for 5 years.
Yeah.
I understand it's a capital investment. It takes a long time and a lot of money to replace things across, think of a retail location that's got retail, nationwide. Not saying they're my customer, but think of like a Target or something like that. I get that, but you've got years to plan for it. But so there is no. I have little sympathy except for, if you're going to make a business decision, the things going into life, into service in 3 years, we're going to, pay the extended service fee and nurse it along for another 5 to 7 years. I mean, the point of sale vendors, retailers, they want to keep, and it makes sense from one perspective. If it works, why replace it? It's a computer that's running my cash register. It's a point of sale system. Why should I be replacing it, upgrading it? It's a price of doing business in our connected technological world. Anyway,
SonicWall has an interesting market share too, because you tend to see a lot of SonicWall in ICS and OT environments for some reason.
More environments where they don't want to rip out and replace stuff on a regular basis. They just want to have stuff that works and let it go.
Smaller environments too, right? It's not an enterprise with 100,000 users, right? Like I've got 3 sites, and each of those 3 sites have 10 systems or whatever, right?
Yeah, very highly distributed, small operation market. Yeah.
Jeff, I had two stories in there. One, and we can cover this at a later date because I did not read these stories, and I'm happy to defer that to a future show, where maybe we just dedicate a segment of the segment to talking about, one, how does TLS work, and two, the elegant maths, plural, behind the RSA encryption. I don't know if you had a chance to digest those. They are not easy to digest.
No, that's not something that we would begin to do justice to in the waning moments of our news segment.
I think we table that for a future. Maybe we give ourselves a week or two to collectively.
Even the next time we need to fill a spot and we're looking for a technical segment, let's just dedicate it to a discussion of how does TLS work and why is it a big deal? Why is it not a big deal? Depending on your perspective.
My take on that is, like, if we Black Hat's coming up, for example, if we did a person on the street interview and shoved a microphone in random people's faces walking around Black Hat and DEF CON, who largely are seasoned, highly technical security professionals, and said, describe to me how TLS and or SSL and or RSA or even Diffie-Hellman works, right? Like, you'd get a wide variety of answers, right?
Yeah,
I'm not saying everyone would be wrong. Everyone have their different take as to high level to how much detail they can go in. But I think the further detail you go in, the smaller that crowd gets, right? That can really explain.
And unless they sat recently for their CISSP exam, they're probably not going to be very accurate.
I think it was Dimitri who was in studio last week that was like, yeah, that's a lot of that stuff is like you study for the test and then you forget, right? Because you don't necessarily have to apply that in a large percentage of our daily, work environments.
I do think asymmetric, like public-private key, is kind of a fun topic to talk about. I mean, and it would be a nice. I'm not volunteering because I got things to do right now.
You're volunteer because it requires research. Is what you're saying, John, right?
It does. It would be a nice topic, though. I mean, RSA in very you can say it in a sentence. I mean, RSA.
I want to hear you say it.
Cryptography depends on exponentiation of prime numbers.
Yes,
and the fact
prime
that
numbers.
You cannot reverse that mathematical equation quickly. That's the fundamental of RSA. It really is. But
and the fundamental, the way I described RSA, exactly that to the intern.
It's factoring.
It's factoring prime numbers, right?
Yeah.
But I described Diffie-Hellman as basically a splitting of the key into two pieces, public and private, right?
There you go.
Yeah, and that's a good high-level definition. But I strongly recommend that every security professional listen to or read the book Crypto by Steve Levy. That goes into the history behind it, the people behind it, gets into what they were experiencing when they were discovering these algorithms. Doesn't get too deep into the math behind it. But when I was listening to that book, I was like, oh, they're talking about these papers that Diffie-Hellman and Merkle, people forget about Merkle, right, wrote back in the day. And I'm like, what? I'm curious what's in these papers. And you get past the first paragraph, and I'm like, holy crap, that's a lot of mathematical formulas that I have no idea what they're saying.
Yeah.
Right? It gets deep really fast.
Well, you need to study some linear algebra and group theory and everything else. But I got a degree in this stuff, strangely enough. Anyway,
so I nominate you and Jeff. I nominate the whole team, the whole team to have this discussion. It's going to be a team.
We all got to bring it to the table.
Yeah.
I would have to go back and read up. I still have my cryptography book, which has got all the details in it. But elliptic curve I find fascinating, is still to this day, and it's finally starting to be adopted. But the cost savings computationally of elliptic curve versus RSA, basically it's a mathematical reduction. It's additive instead of exponentiation.
Yep.
And the computational cost savings are massive, and I would even go as far to say as if it wasn't for elliptic curve, we would really have a significant problem with miniaturization of devices today. But the fact that elliptic curve exists is a huge.
That was RSA's problem in the beginning that the book talks about, Joff, is the computational resources to do that factoring of prime numbers was the limiting factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a real deal.
We all experience the impact of the impact of encryption and the load on it. If you do any kind of in-person shopping at a brick and mortar with a credit card, and you now have a chip card, how much longer do you have to wait to complete the transaction these days versus a few years ago when it was just swipe and be on your way because the authorization
and swipe in plain text.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was plain text transmission versus we gotta stop and do a key exchange.
Power up a chip and then do some cryptography. Yeah. Yep.
It's amazing how it affects our everyday lives, and digging into the details gets very quickly into a lot of math, right? A lot of complex stuff.
We're gonna have to do something.
We do.
All right. I'll think about it. I'll contact Jeff.
Also, I think also key validation is kind of an interesting thing when we think about the difference between PGP and the RSA algorithm, right? And how they're validating the public key, which is super important, right? In PGP, raise your hand if you've been to a PGP key signing party. Right, that was the way we validated PGP keys, right? Back in the day, that's how we validated PGP keys. In the RSA algorithm, we have certificate authorities that help us with that, and that was interesting to kind of reflect on that now and in how that's played out. I think it's really fascinating. Okay, so future episodes. I think we're all in agreement. We're going to dig into that. I did want to talk about a really funny story. And it was someone actually disclosed a vulnerability in a backdoor. And basically, the vulnerability is if you connect to the backdoor Win32 IRC bot that listens on TCP port 6777, that you can execute commands. And there is no authentication. The only requirement is commands must be wrapped in quotes or it will fail. As I quote from the description. I'm like, is that a bug or is that a feature? I don't know.
I think it's a feature.
It's a feature, right? They made it easy to execute commands, which I thought was pretty. My nomination for awesome disclosure of the week was my story number 6.
We call that a morale boost. That's
right.
Absolutely.
We call that
something lightweight.
Vintage retro
morale boost. Yeah.
Also on the subject, we haven't talked about. Let's talk about 15 because that's way more interesting. Security implications of misconfigurations. This was a post from Cisco Talus Group, and they went through these scenarios when they were analyzing just DNS traffic and telemetry. They were able to identify domains that weren't registered but receiving traffic, like with their visibility into DNS. Like, you need a lot of passive sensors and infrastructure to do that. Once you build up to that point, you can go like, hey, no one owns this domain, but it's getting some traffic. And then you can register that domain and go like, what is that traffic? So in one case, you can
do that the opposite way though too, right? Like we actually look for old domains that they stopped registering, or if they rebranded or were acquired.
Yes.
We would look for those domains because traffic, like you said, in this one, traffic ends up coming to you if you can register those.
The first case I think was the most interesting, Tyler, to your point, right? There was a domain that had expired, but it had expired because there was like a triple acquisition merger that had happened, right? Like the original company got acquired, and then that company that acquired them had gotten acquired, and then they let like one of the original domains from the company, the first company that had been acquired, they let it expire, and there was still requests from clients requesting wpad.dat, which, as we know, allows you to say the proxy servers that you're allowed to use, and then you could, if you were an attacker to register that domain, you could inspect all of the traffic that was being transmitted.
WPAD, man. WPAD needs to be retired right now.
Right? And this was all just from DNS. And Talus was like, we went to the company and we got it fixed. Like, props to them. That's pretty cool. They also found a typo squatting domain, speaking of the problem we were talking about earlier, that was having requests to VPN connections from that company, right? Like, they basically typo squatted a domain, and got VPN connections to that one. And then the other one was a typo in the MX server record.
Oh, interesting.
So like it was like, like relay.example.com, but someone forgot the dot. So it ended up being relayexample.com. Well, then all I have to do is register relayexample.com, and lo and behold, I control your email. And I think that comes down to the title.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
With or without a homoglyph.
The security implications of but those misconfigurations in DNS, I found in my experience super hard to detect. Like when we think of misconfiguration, we think of like, oh, I misconfigured an FTP service or an AWS service, or like misconfigurations in DNS are hard to spot.
Well, and not even just misconfigurations.
It's a thing that I do once in a while. I will literally just traffic dump, TCP dump or Wireshark, whatever, my DNS traffic and just watch for a while.
Yeah.
Because these things happen even in well-run networks by people who know better.
Well, it's not even misconfigurations, right, Jeff? It's things that have been legacied or expired, like printers. Printers are a great example. When a printer goes away, you sit on an airplane and do packet sniffing for any given time, you'll see all kinds of printer requests. Printers are super noisy.
Oh my God, yeah.
On a network, there's printers that are legacied and the DNS records don't go away.
Hey, everybody got a really drink, and then there is the Bonjour protocol.
Oh my God.
You ready?
Yeah. Cheers.
It does segue into Bonjour, broadcast traffic, multicast traffic.
Multicast, yeah.
I think HC Moore at Rumble is doing a great job in taking advantage of those protocols to do discovery. A lot of that's, Rumble kind of based, and I mean, it goes back to Carlos Perez, but I'm like, dude.
What was the other webcast we just did, or that we looked at on ESW that was doing something very similar? Wasn't it Qualys? That is looking at that layer 2 and 3 traffic and just sniffing to find fingerprints.
Yeah.
It's actually astounding. If you're on an on-site engagement, and I've done this before, and you've got access to the network, just to sit there with a sniffer for a while, just watch.
Yeah, I agree, John.
I mean, it's just watch what's going on. It's like you can learn so much about how poorly or not that environment's configured. You might find router announcements. It's like, oh, look.
There's even tools that visualize that, right?
The network.
It's unbelievable broadcast and multicast traffic, how that's still just amazing in understanding what's happening on the network and how much stuff people have forgotten about, because so many of these devices, just legacy or not, implement these protocols and announce themselves.
I can't wait to see IPv6 implications of this long term.
Oh, baby. IPv6 is all multicast.
We obviously do a lot of, AV. We have a lot of AV gear, and I noticed that certain AV gear will give you an iOS app, and in the iOS app, it'll be like, "Hey, here are all of your mixing boards that are connected to your network." And I'm like, "Wait a minute, how the hell did you know what those?" Like, they give me a list, like, "Hey, at this IP address, you have this model mixing board." I'm like, "Wait."
Well, I've even done nothing but Roku's and stuff, right? Like Roku's and Chromecast,
I've done nothing but start up the app, and all of a sudden what's on my network.
Multicast away.
And to your point, Joff, I fire up a sniffer, and I'm like, oh, all I need to do is send this packet to the broadcast address of my network, and all my mixers respond. To your point, Tyler, Roku's work. That a lot of this shit works the same way. It just announces itself on the network. It's amazing.
Do you know what? In the world of IPv6, there is no broadcast.
Yes. Is that a security? Is that one of the security enhancements? It introduces security, not enhancements, but yeah.
I would call it a security enhancement, but at the same time, some of the additional multicast protocols that have been introduced actually are
even worse than the broadcast.
Less than enhancements.
Right.
In the security sense. So it sort of cuts both ways.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, I noticed that. I mean, you guys probably run Ubiquity. I know, Tyler, you do, right? Because we collaborate in a lot of Ubiquity stuff all the time. And you can turn off like multicast and broadcast on your Wi-Fi, but when you do that, it breaks a ton of IoT shit.
Oh yeah, break a bunch of stuff.
It breaks everything.
I had to turn it off because it would just break. It would break too much. It would break the initial discovery, right?
I was trying to do it in like VLAN segments for like guest segments of like SSIDs, and like that was a nightmare.
Yeah. I did one more story I want to cover quickly is my story number 12, how to test WordPress plugin performance and security. What I thought was cool from this article, it talks about a lot of stuff that most of us already know. If you have WordPress and you're looking to gain more visibility, go read the full article. If you're slightly more advanced, skip to the section that was new to me, that in Chrome's built-in dev tools, it shows you how to use the like inspect feature to report on unused CSS and JavaScript files on your website.
That's actually kind of cool.
That was cool. Like, I was wondering, what are the security implications and or attack vectors here? Like, I ran it against a couple of sites and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, there's a JavaScript file that Chrome is telling me is unused. Is that just a performance thing, or is that could I abuse that for some security purposes?
I think you could have to chain something together, like if maybe they orphaned a domain and you could register that, or if you've got a local file upload and you can point to that missing JavaScript, like
that's a good
part of like a file inclusion
path.
Hold
on, Tyler, go back. I'm including JavaScript that, I mean, this would tell you that it's not used, but if the domain it's loading the JavaScript from is orphaned, I control that domain. Holy crap, if I can inject JavaScript from there, now I can inject JavaScript into every browser that visits your website.
Yeah,
Winning.
so
That's a win.
It is potentially an interesting topic in the JavaScript heavy frameworks on the front end of the browser, things like React and Angular and so forth, where and I've used this as a testing technique where you actually modify a JavaScript function with an interception proxy coming back, and you tell the application, go into debugging mode instead of being in production mode.
Right.
Angular is a good example. And then you can actually view a lot more about the objects. It actually builds debugging tree information, all kinds of interesting things. So, there's material there. And in the modern frameworks, if you're a web app person, in these modern JavaScript frameworks, you're going to spend, I can tell you right now, a heck of a lot of time in the developer console in the browser, because that's where the action is.
Oh,
frankly.
Totally agree.
That's where it's happening.
And I love the feature in Burp Suite. There's two little checkboxes that are my favorite features in the intercept proxy. And one is show me all hidden fields and highlight them. And the other is remove all JavaScript that's doing field level validation. Like, that's like it's just so...
It's beautiful.
It lets me put whatever data I want in the application to send back to the server. I'm like, well, that's where it's at, right? That's where I think a lot of dynamic scanners have a tough time, because you need a human to go look at that stuff in a browser and go, well, what if I send it this versus... I mean, basically you're transitioning from like just automated fuzzing to a human going, what if I put this value in, right?
And you're still doing API fuzzing basically on the back end, but
then you send it to repeater or intrude. It's awesome.
And just
have that X factor of creativity.
It's just that's how I got a vaccine. Stuff. That's my friend Bob tells me that's how I got a vaccine.
Hey, so it feels like we're out of stories.
I agree. We are out of stories. Thank you, everyone, for coming on the show this evening. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Thank you for the meat scented candles, too. Over and out.